Okay, so we had this conversation about fatherhood 2 or 3 months ago. And in some sense, the whole conversation ended up being about authority in an implicit way. But there was an explicit point where, I mean, when you described to me that authority in that new way, which is something I don't think I'd ever heard before, that and my understanding was of it was that authority is in a very sort of basic sense is the capacity to connect a higher order pattern to someone who is unable to see that pattern, but you
Mm.
are able to see it, and you connect them to it. You give them vision of it, such that
Yeah,
they can find a deeper purchase on reality than they could before.
yeah.
And that was really significant for me, and it seems to have been significant for a bunch of people. So we're gonna pick up on
Pick
authority
up
more
there, sure.
generally.
Yeah.
And so I had mentioned to you that there's this talk, so I'll link this in the video description. But there's a presentation of a paper from David from 2 years ago on the dignified and the efficient.
I think it was more than 2 years ago. I'd have to,
Was
or
it?
maybe it was. I don't know. I don't remember the date. Feels like it was longer ago, but that could just be me.
Yeah. Well, and so then you mentioned it's part of this larger book. So tell us again this. So this book is in review
So,
for publication right now.
right. So I finished a manuscript finally. It's called um, Authority and Its Counterfeits. And the subtitle is uh, A Political, Poetical, Philosophical, and Theological Theory. So it's an attempt to try to think about the nature of authority from its roots
Hmm.
and in a kind of a philosophical, maybe phenomenological way, just seeing the role that authority plays in life, and then but then making a connecting it to larger questions about intellectual history and so forth. And not to go too deeply into the weeds here, but it's there are three parts. The first part is a more general philosophical reflection that connects authority with beauty. I
Hmm.
respond to a general tendency to think about authority in terms of power,
Hmm.
meaning practical organization. It's a matter
Hmm.
of putting setting things in order. And
Hmm.
while all that's true, it just seems to me that's not the heart of it. I think of authority
Hmm.
not just as putting order in things, but actually opening up the meaning of existence to its transcendent roots.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
uh, so sort of setting the horizon, the light,
Hmm.
against which you actually have a horizon and have an order. So it's got an intellectual dimension as well as a practical dimension, and that the first part sort of thinks through those things. The second part gives a kind of interpretation of authority from a Christian perspective, according to the three symbols of the prophet, the priest, and the king.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
And
Okay. Yep.
the lecture that you referenced was the heart of the chapter on the king, basically.
Sure. That makes sense. Yeah.
And then the third, and I argue that actually authority is always going to be analogical. It's going to be a unity that divides into these three aspects
Okay.
of
Okay.
of bearing witness and
Yep.
this logical dimension, and then also a kind of a political dimension.
So if
If I
just
may, just to finish the last,
oh
just
yeah,
to,
sorry.
the whole
Yeah.
structure, and then the last part, I take America as an example of an attempt to lay out a political structure without authority. So
Right.
politics, it's kind of
Right.
like an experiment of politics without authority,
Right.
and the various ways in which it tries to our founding principles try to um, perform the function of authority without having to make that appeal to the theological dimension and so forth. And I think through how that affects the way Americans tend to think,
Yep.
the certain kind of spirit in the culture. So look at the cultural dimension. So that's anyway the whole picture. But I'm sorry I cut you off. You were
No, no. I mean, I'll be very excited to read that when it comes out. Or, I mean, if you want to send me the manuscript, that you're welcome to do that too. But
hey,
I
yeah,
will also certainly purchase it when it comes available
yeah.
for purchase.
It's how books go. I don't expect to know one way or the other until probably the end of the year whether it's coming out. And things go well, it'll be out next year. So these things take a long time.
Yeah. Um, I wanted to. So the thing that sparked for me that I was gonna go
Yeah.
with was you mentioned the three roles
Mm.
of prophet, priest, and king, and I just wanted to sort of reflect back to you sort of what I saw with that and see if I'm
Okay.
if I'm on the right track. Like,
Sure.
so if the prophet is sort of the one who the person who discloses a pattern that no one's seen before,
Yeah.
might be right, like someone who
Right.
someone who has the insight to a pattern that's new. And
Hmm.
then the king is the one who, like, and I think a lot about, the Old Testament dynamic between the prophet and the king, which is very
Right.
significant.
Absolutely.
And constantly you're having the king sort of dropping down into this efficient power model and
Yeah.
going awry,
Yeah.
and then the prophet is trying to come back and say and trying to disclose this higher pattern to him, and when he's a
Exactly.
good king he responds properly to that.
Correct. Yeah.
um
That's great. Yeah.
and then the priest is the person who meets who mediates, because the prophet can sort of like can share it initially, but not in a way, usually not in a way that everyone can hear it.
Hmm.
And the
Hmm.
priest is sort of the person that can take it from that level and then bring it down to connect to your everyday person, something like that.
Yeah. That's really great. Yeah. You should have maybe written the book.
No, no, I don't think
But,
so.
but one of the things that I emphasize with the prophet in particular is that the prophet, so the king is the office of authority.
Mm,
Authority is a kind of a ruling office, and
okay.
it's institutional, it's official, it's publicly recognized. Um, and the prophet is the one who sort of stands outside of office. It's not officially appointed, but in a way from a more kind of grassroots way or natural way, um, is able to call attention to the truth. So the prophet sees truth, beauty, and goodness, and is
Hmm.
from a kind of philosophical perspective, you might say,
Yeah.
or I mean, art in a way plays this role too. It's interesting, art and philosophy. Um,
Mm,
but
mm,
the priest is the one then who mediates the theological dimension. So I think of it as in a kind of a sacramental fashion. The priest doesn't rule,
hmm.
um, but it's the priest who bears witness to the fact that the ruler receives the authority that he has from
Hmm.
God, from the transcendent realm.
Hmm.
So as you were saying, the priest, there's always a tendency for the priest to degenerate into the efficiency power. That's exactly right. And it seems to me that that's protected on both sides, both because of the priest
Hmm.
who calls to mind God and the prophet who says, this is what's true. It's speaking truth to power, as it were. Um,
Right. Oh yeah, nice.
who's able to refer to the truth of nature, the truth of the world, the truth of
Mm,
reality in a way.
yeah.
So the three working together, in a way, configure the whole complex reality of authority.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this aspect of authority as mediation
Yeah,
is, I think, pivotal for me anyway, because as you were talking earlier about the sort of the hollowing out of authority that has happened
yeah,
in sort of probably post-enlightenment, post-liberal world for
yeah,
sure.
yeah,
And America generally, I think.
yeah.
And the sense that I had always understood authority as basically a justification for power.
Hmm.
Right. It's simply just a way of like assigning a particular role, a justificatory
Yeah.
license to use their power.
Right.
Um, and
Right.
maybe
I think,
just
and that really is I mean, if you were to look up, that's how, for example, on the Stanford, the classic internet encyclopedia of philosophy, which is really excellent. Look up authority there. That's exactly how it's described. That really is sort of the default. universally sort of assumed conception of authority.
So does that so you mentioned in your talk about the dignified and the efficient, you mentioned the radical pluralism that's necessary at the roots of liberalism.
Mhm.
Does that does that sense of authority becoming just a justification for power, does that does that necessarily follow from that? Because like once you have that sort of that turn towards pluralism
Mhm.
and you've given over even the possibility of a truth consensus,
Yeah.
um, or even aiming at the possibility of such. Like there's a difference between requiring the actual consensus of truth
Right.
and a recognition that there is an actual truth consensus that would be ideal and aiming towards it.
Yeah. No, you're right. I think it is. It's hard. It's hard. So there's a clear connection between the loss of authority and radical pluralism because,
Hmm.
in both cases, you have the absence of any transcendent point of reference.
Right, and that's the thing.
Yeah. So so what do you do? I mean, the problem with pluralism, you don't want to just say there. Although I should say there are many people these days. There are quite a few movements afoot that are gaining momentum and virulence too. In fact, that are tired of the lack of authority, and
Yeah,
so
yeah,
in a kind of a desperate way want to just assert a new authority and be
yeah,
done with this chaos. And I have to say I'm very sympathetic with that in one
yeah.
respect. I'm also very sympathetic with the people that are horrified by
Right.
that
Yeah,
vision of things. And I think that we find ourselves in a really complicated
yeah,
condition now because, in fact, that the not only is authority hard to find, the foundations for authority have been absent for so long that it's not. This is not a problem that one can just fix overnight. In fact, this book that I was just telling you about, it closes with a reflection on Nietzsche. I think
mm,
Nietzsche's death of God, what he was at, I mean, it's funny to think about Nietzsche in these terms, but I think what he was lamenting in a way is a lack of authority.
mm-hmm,
You know,
mm-hmm.
we tend to think of Nietzsche as kind of championing the libertine or whatever, but in fact, that's not a very good reading of Nietzsche. I think he's much more interesting. I think for him, the will to power is a substitute for authority.
Mm,
Um,
mm.
uh, but
Yeah,
we
interesting
all
because
we
it's
all
sort of
know
in
it's. Go ahead.
well, because my intuition there is something like that the will to power is sort of the inverse of authority in that way. Like
Yeah,
you're striving upwards towards the higher pattern that you can no longer see because it's not disclosed to you anymore.
I mean, you're exactly right. That's it seems, I mean, if you read the text from the gay science on the death of God, I mean, that's
Right.
basically, we've killed God and now we need to become gods to compensate.
Yeah, yeah,
And,
yeah,
the will to power is sort of a compensation for this lack of authority. I mean, I think Nietzsche was an extraordinarily interesting person for having felt the absence of authority more profoundly than just about anyone. So I mean, in that way,
yeah,
he's really fascinating. But his solutions that he proposes are disturbing to say the very least. And then the historical outworking of some of that has just been horrendous. So I mean, we're in a really dramatic moment because I think as a culture we're coming to see the loss of authority
yeah,
more clearly than generations before us.
yeah,
But we've done so much to bury the sources of authority
yeah.
that our way out is going to be difficult. So I don't think that it suffices just to call on some super self-assertive will to power to
Right.
compensate. But I do think the very first thing that we can and should do is to try to understand what's going on as well as we can. So
Yeah.
become attuned to what it means and to see why there is there is a connection between a radical pluralism and this absence of authority. And, even if the answer to the problem is not evident, at least we become attuned to this idea that somehow we need to recover something that is genuinely unifying, that really
Yeah.
is can properly sustain us all.
Well, it has
Um,
to be something deep enough and high enough that
yeah,
it actually has the capacity. Gosh, so many things to say
yeah,
here. But what like what okay, so I mean the thing there, right? Like so if you have a vacuum of an absolutely necessary human a piece of a human community.
yeah,
And I think, you talked about this in that talk again, where you juxtapose the man as a political animal and man as a rational animal.
hmm,
And the dichotomy that opens up between those in the absence of authority.
yeah,
And
yeah,
and that if we live in that vacuum for long enough, it will collapse. We will collapse it with something. And
right,
the answer of the will to power is sort of the answer of pride, right? And 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 that's the thing about genuine authority, as far as I can tell. I mean, I've just been sort of ruminating and reflecting on it ever since, and trying to like get the phenomenological sense of authority, right?
yeah,
And the background for that for me personally is that I'm a medical practitioner.
yeah,
I do medicine, and as far as I can tell, the role of a doctor, PA, NP,
hmm,
someone who has the authority to prescribe medications, right? We even use the word authority,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
Um, like I think we are the priests of the modern world.
yeah, yeah,
And
right,
because the only acknowledged higher order
yeah,
patterns that are collectively acknowledged as real is the scientific. And the
yeah,
place that the scientific meets the individual is the
hmm,
medical room, right?
hmm,
And so my sense in this has been to try to feel my way through. I mean, I get lots of opportunities. I see lots of patients to feel my way through. How do I inhabit the role
yeah,
where I can properly bring authority,
hmm,
and mediate between someone who is sick for all sorts of reasons
hmm,
in a way that actually might give them the capacity to transcend themselves,
yeah,
which is I think is the ultimate goal of authority. It's like
yeah,
you're affording transcendence to
yeah,
to the one that is mediated for.
yeah,
And it's like the the thing that's necessary to get to the place of authority is humility.
hmm, yeah.
Like I don't so so and so this okay. So with that in the background, let me bring in another piece and ask you a question. So one of the things that I've thought about
I
is
already have a lot of things to say in response
I
to what you said, but
know.
I'll hold off. I mean, that there's so much that's interesting in what you just laid out, but I'll let you ask your question first.
Okay. Well, you're welcome to bring in whatever you'd like. But so the question is there an ambivalence, a moral ambivalence to authority?
Mm-hmm.
Because one could mediate higher order patterns that are not connected to the highest order pattern,
Right,
i.e., one could be authoritative as a priest of Moloch or
right,
of Mammon, even better, right?
right.
They can, in a sense, your financial advisor is a priest of Mammon,
Yeah,
right? And like
right,
they
right.
like they can mediate something for you. They can have real authority. So authority, you know, the level of pattern that it's oriented towards, in the level of transcendence that it's oriented towards, which
Yeah,
is going to be somehow predicated maybe on humility and these
yeah.
other things too. So that's
Oh my goodness. Yeah, no, there's so much there. So first of all, um I think your description of medicine as involving authority is really crucial. Boy, there's so many things. Let me see how let me begin by this. First of all, um, uh, we need to distinguish between humility and a kind of a false modesty.
mm,
So
hmm,
I think you're absolutely right. If authority involves a kind of a bearing witness to an order that transcends one, then if there's no humility, there's no authority. That's going to be lacking. But one can sometimes think of uh, humility as implying a reluctance to make a judgment or a
mm,
reluctance to take charge, and
mm-hmm,
in fact, in a certain sense, assert oneself. And in medicine, I think this is really practical. I've been in some situations. My wife has a number of conditions, and at one point we were talking to a doctor, and he he in a way was checked out and wanted to just leave in front of us a dozen options and just leave it to us to make a decision. And you feel sort of helpless there. You actually don't feel free. You want the doctor to actually say what he thinks would be best because you trust that he knows things that you can't see. And in a certain sense, you feel freer with this authoritative, insightful guide through this complex set of decisions that one has to make. And what's so interesting about this, and I'm sure you know, I mean, this can get quite real. There are plenty of studies that have shown that uh, uh, the the relationship between the doctor and the patient has a profound bearing on the patient's capacity to be healed. I mean, the health outcome.
Yeah.
And I find that we tend to interpret that in just sort of psychological terms. Just if you feel better, you might, or if you're trusting, you'll be more optimistic, and somehow that'll affect your body. Or I mean, maybe that's at work there, but it seems to me that there's something really interesting. One of the etymological um, meanings of authority is it's related to the word to augment, to increase
Mm.
or augment, to make grow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the exercise of authority, rather than power asserting itself and sort of crushing the one who obeys, authority actually liberates
Mm-hmm.
and elevates the
Mm-hmm.
one who obeys him, and the person grows. And if you think of health as a kind of a growth, the doctor who genuinely asserts lives authority, takes the risk of authority,
Yes. Yes.
and a patient who trusts that actually establishes conditions for the patient to grow and actually be healed.
Yeah.
Um, it's kind of interesting. In the Middle Ages, the king who had authority was recognized. There have been books written on this. It's so fascinating, and I don't know quite what to make of it, but it was recognized that the king actually had a healing touch. I
Mm.
don't know if you've heard about this, but there's
No.
a it was in the Middle Ages, especially in France and in England. People would come, the sick would come to the king to be touched. There was a particular kind of
Interesting.
skin
Interesting.
disease, and who knows, but of course all sorts of miracles were attested to. And I just find, whatever one makes of that, I just find the symbolic
Mm-hmm.
um, resonance of this quite real and quite illuminating.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, but okay, so that's one dimension.
Mhm.
A humility that also then risks taking the lead,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is different from just self-assertion. And then the other point that you were talking about, which I think is really crucial, is the danger of a false authority.
Yeah.
And that danger is always, in a way, one of the reasons we've tried to arrange politics without authority is that authority is always risky.
Right.
And
Right.
inevitably, there's a kind of a risk that's going to be involved when you have a kind of an authority structure. And there's no way to avoid that, it seems to me. But it's good and healthy, I think, to keep in mind in the end that authority can only be such to the extent that it takes as absolute what is in fact absolute.
Right. Right.
And anything that's lower than that, like mammon, money, or some other consideration, the moment that becomes the like ultimate reference point, you're going to have a disorder and a kind of power struggles of various sorts. So
Yeah.
the only way really to be a kind of a pure channel, you might say, for the healing movement of
Yeah.
authority is if you make what's actually highest, and that ultimately
Right.
is God. I mean,
Right.
there's
Right.
no way around that. It seems to me.
Well, yeah, so a couple things, but the first one is, that along with the humility piece, I really liked how you brought in the riskiness of humility and
Yeah,
distinguish it from false modesty or you know, just self-assertion.
yeah,
Um, in a sense, it seems like genuine authority is predicated necessarily on love
yeah.
in the sense that like I can't if I in a very real situation if I'm seeing a patient who's 350 pounds and I'm trying to bring to bear an authority that actually invites them to transcendence because I think that's the right way to think about it. It's like
Yeah,
genuine authority is actually more of an invitation
yeah.
than an exercise of power. There's times that it's at least in the setting of like individual to individual. I'm not
Hmm.
necessarily thinking so much about the political, but like in just a person to person interaction. If the classic thing is to just say, well, you need to lose weight. Here's here's a diet you should follow. Good luck.
Hmm.
And there's a way in which like you've very briefly just sort of like told them that there's a better pattern and you've given them a very scant map to get there
Hmm.
and you've left them alone, right? You've sort of removed yourself from the situation and just othered them. And there's a different thing, and I mean I use that example because this is one of the places that I'm paying attention to this the most is how can I come into that place and care about the person and care for their highest good, but actually and this is a dimension of this that I'm really curious to hear more from you. It's like, yes, I have to witness the higher order thing, and I'm bearing witness to something that's above me
Hmm.
to bring it down. And as you said, be a pure channel, right? Like
Hmm.
the distortion within me is the thing that will distort the authority. But if I'm not also witnessing them, if I haven't if I don't properly comport myself to
Yeah,
the person that I'm attempting to mediate for,
yeah.
if I'm not also witnessing them,
Right,
then it will fall on its face
right,
and become some sort of manipulation.
right. Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right, which is why ultimately authority is personal. It involves
Mm,
actually a person. It can't be just. It's not a program that just gets installed. I mean that's an example of trying to organize without authority is a kind of self-operating system or program or set of controls. I read an article about a nurse who was complaining about some of the AI um, um, instruments that are being introduced, and there's sometimes judgments that are given to them, commands that are given to them by these, you know, complex algorithms in the case of a patient that they know by virtue of long experience that are wrong and potentially dangerous, and they have to either follow the protocol that is given and do damage, potentially damage to the patient, but they know they're not going to get in trouble,
mm,
or take the risk of overriding the instruction that they're given, which is a risk because they could turn out to be wrong and get
right.
in very serious trouble. But
Yeah.
it's also then, and I mean, so you see, there can be a really profound risk in making an authoritative decision. But this is why it really requires a kind of heroism, or at least it can in certain
Yeah.
circumstances. And you see, you're exactly right. You mediate, which means you have to be attentive both to the, universal transcendent order and the absolute particularity and uniqueness of the individual in front of you and the circumstances that situation presents, and somehow make a synthesis. Authority, prudence in the
Mm,
classical sense of the virtue is right at the heart of what authority does in the practical sphere. The
mm.
uniting of the universal and the particular, and that requires, as you say, I mean, you say it's predicated on love. I mean, in a way, authority is love
Yeah.
expressed in a particular, this form.
Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. It's almost like an aspect of love.
Yeah, and notice though, it's not. I've been putting it in just in terms of being attentive to the particularities, but it's more than that. It's also having a genuine affection for and care for. So attentive in that sense of being um, feeling the claim that the other is placing on you, or
Hmm.
being responsive to the presence of the other person.
Yeah.
Effective, affectively as much as intellectually.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean that aspect, right? The aspect of the I don't know what's the right word. The the components of an interaction that are below the level of language, right?
Hmm.
Just
Hmm. Yeah,
all
yeah.
which are myriad and I think beyond knowledge. As I continue to try to feel into doing this, like it seems to be by far the most significant piece that has to happen to get right to afford the possibility of a genuine connection because you can feel it when it happens and when it doesn't.
Hmm. Oh yeah, yeah.
And 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 if there's not a trust already there,
Right,
then the attempt to exercise authority is relatively meaningless.
right, right. No, isn't
And
that
the,
isn't that yeah? But did you know this is why I actually? Oh, sorry, I'm cutting you off though.
that's fine.
But
No,
just to insert this here, this is why I think beauty is so interesting. Why I mean,
okay.
I have to say that was one of the biggest revelations for me in thinking about authority was um, connecting it to beauty. When that
Mm,
finally dawned on me, it just seemed to come out of nowhere. But then you start looking at the tradition, you realize it's absolutely everywhere. But
mm,
it just had never occurred to me. So what is beauty? What's interesting about beauty is, and beauty has analogous. It doesn't mean necessarily just pretty or whatever. But the experience of beauty is the experience of being moved by something before you even understand why. You might not even explain why, but you're you've been you've something has entered into you and disposed you towards the thing,
yeah.
um,
Yeah.
in a way
Yeah.
beyond your deliberate activity. So that when if you make a deliberate act, it's sort of riding the momentum of this movement that's already this being disposed. And
Yeah. Yeah.
that I think is essential. That's one of the things that differentiates authority from
Mm.
power. Power sort of forces something, but
Oh,
beauty moves you and then invites, and you're already and this is what allows you then to participate really from yourself and freely, rather than through coercion.
oh, that's really good. Okay, so this is this why you said that art is
Yeah,
is
part of
authoritative in this?
yeah,
Like, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Oh,
yeah.
that's
No,
really nice. Okay.
it's yeah. It's kind of interesting. This is a sort of side note, but just this morning I saw a headline. I didn't read the article that was from some science magazine, but they discovered that what was it? Something like a scent can um, provoke a kind of consent
Mm.
or uh, uh, understanding, even like open your mind. And that's really kind of interesting. And this is it's sort of this is kind of how it seems to me it's analogous to, if you think of beauty as not just in sight but also the other senses, that we all recognize that there's
Yeah.
you enter into a room that smells good and has a nice feels nice and has a nice lighting or whatever, and you enter into it more fully. You don't,
Yeah.
if one that's cold and off-putting, there's a you find yourself sort of clenched up and defensive
Yeah.
and protecting yourself against it. But a certain smell, a taste that your senses can actually dispose your whole body, which then includes your mind and your
Yeah.
will,
Yeah.
positively towards something. And I think that that's that's something that when you're interacting with a particular person,
Yeah.
there are ways in which you're communicating, as you said, sort of below words. You might say both below and above words.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're kind of communicating already with the person through gestures and unconsciously the way you smile, the kind of what's being expressed through your face, and that is helping the person to understand and inspiring them to trust. You
Yeah.
know, of course, these things can be abused. This is the charismatic personality that
Yeah.
can wreak havoc. Uh,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
to recognize that doesn't require us to, deny the reality of this dimension.
Well, I mean, yeah, it speaks to that possibility of a false authority, right? Uh,
Yeah.
it's counterfeits, right? That's part of your book title.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
But it made me think of one of the things. So you started off the talk of the dignified and the efficient with this, reflection on an episode of the TV show The Crown, right? And
Yeah,
this
yeah,
moment that the young Queen Elizabeth is introduced to the distinction between the dignified and the efficient. And part of what you said is that, she is called to become someone. She is
yeah.
called to her. She is called to an excellence of character and a capacity of knowledge in a tradition, a sense of virtue, right? A sense of
Yeah,
character
right.
and virtue, such that she is able to bear the weight of the authority.
Yeah,
And that part, and I think that's kind of part of what we're gesturing at here too, is like, you know, I and again, I just keep coming back to my experience because I want to ground
yeah,
all of this. But like in my experience, when I am having a day where I'm struggling to be, for whatever reason, I'm struggling to be present, and I'm not my best self. Let's just say for a
mhm,
rough,
yeah, yeah,
like I'm not going to do a very good job of exercising authority on those days. I
yeah.
I know
Right,
I don't. Right
right.
now, I'm certainly able to do it at the standard my job requires, but not, what I'm interested in doing is much higher than that.
Yeah,
But then there's other days where I am
inspired.
where where all the various components of the character and the capacity to participate virtues are more active. And when that happens, the underlying current just carries you with it.
Yeah, that's right.
You,
Yeah,
like, you very much are carried along by something, but it's like it's there's something about the character of the individual who's attempting to participate authority
yeah,
that's absolutely necessary for the thing to land, because it's the thing that lands in spite of you, like when it actually lands,
right.
like because and I think it's in part, like, it's one thing to know, to understand a higher pattern, and that's really significant, to understand, let's say, how to properly prioritize your how your salience landscaping works when you are hungry, right?
Hmm.
Such that you actually are able to eat food that's good for you,
Yeah, yeah,
right? Like, it's one
yeah,
thing, like that's a pattern that I can help you to see, and it's one thing to know that pattern. It's a whole different thing to be able to language it in a way that it lands with that person, and there's
yeah.
no possible way to compute that.
Right, right,
That thing, that
right.
capacity to language it to the particular, to bring the universal to the particular, happens completely in spite of
Yeah,
one's own efforts when it does happen, I think.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's right. But it requires one's own. But so it's in
Yeah, yeah. You're not
it's sort
absent from it.
right, right. You're doing more than you realize, and more than you would be able to do deliberately. but you have to be there. This is something also that like an AI can't do for you, or a computer that wouldn't be able to, in a way, have the kind of presence that this requires. Yeah, the character that you mentioned, it's kind of interesting. So, in one sense, you might say there's something ecstatic about
Mm-hmm.
authority.
Mm-hmm.
When and this is one of the things that struck me so much about the TV series The Crown, especially in the early season. Excuse me, when Elizabeth was just learning what it means to be queen. It was one of the most fascinating things I have ever
Mm.
seen on television. And one of the things that stood out to me so much was this. We tend to think of uh, sort of from a kind of cynical modern American perspective. Kings are people that love to wield power. They're selfish individuals and so forth. And what you realize when you watch this TV series, is that um, there was no selfishness at all. I mean, to be queen required for her to let go of herself. I mean, it was a profoundly ascetical existence, where she had to make decisions from this position that would not necessarily be hers personally, and that was a real asceticism. It required a
Yeah.
real sense of coming out of herself and training, and it seems to me that it would be hard for that to be possible without some deep love of the order that one is bearing witness to. There has to be one has to be see the beauty of it, and see you can't force yourself to do something like that. It has to be
Yeah.
inspired.
Yeah.
And then
Otherwise, it gets nihilistic and bad things will happen in the background in the shadows.
yeah, no, right. And also then becomes a weird, perverse kind of self-assertion too. I mean, you can't
Right. Right. Yeah.
there's no way out of this being, this is the necessity of humility and so forth. But one of the other things that's so interesting about this is then you also inevitably become something like an exemplar.
Hmm.
You mediate the higher order not just by pointing to it, but actually embodying it yourself. And that's essential for being a convincing authority. Um, if you have to not just say it, but have your body say it. It's sort of have it articulated in your very flesh. And you
Yeah.
pointed this out. This happens whether or not you're aware of it. I find it a fascinating phenomenon that whoever happens to be president shapes that the character of the person holding the office in a way shapes the character of the people of the nation. I mean, whether we
Yeah.
like it or
Yeah.
not, it just happens. You see
It
it.
can't help but doing it because it sets the
Yeah,
horizon.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, and this is why there's so much of a responsibility and kind of a burden to the office of
Oh, yeah.
authority.
Yeah. Man, so many things there. One of the things, because I've wanted to talk to you about this for a long time and I've never brought it up. I mean, there's a scene in the symposium that you
Hmm.
talk about in Plato's Critique of Impure Reason, which how we first got connected, obviously,
Yeah.
where and it's been a long time, so I'll try to get it roughly right, but where Alcibiades is, wanting to he's wanting to like he's after Socrates, right? He's
Hmm.
very after Socrates. And Socrates has him sit next to another guy. Like there's a
Hmm.
guy in between them.
Agathon. Yeah.
Yeah, and Agathon's name means something particular.
Means the good. Yeah.
Right, right.
Or
And
of
there
good. Yeah.
yeah, and there's and in the book you show this manner in which like that that staging of them allows Alcibiades to actually come into relation
Hmm.
to Socrates.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that
No, go ahead.
no,
If
that's
you
good.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what's so interesting is it's been a while since I've looked at that book too.
Yeah.
but as I recall, what's so striking there is you have, in a way, the person who's named after the good,
Right.
and so in a way, pretends to be, sort of presents himself as the good, and
Right.
then Socrates, who always says, I know that I don't know, is always saying I lack it, but precisely thereby he becomes transparent to the good that trans. So in a way, Agathon becomes an immanent, purely immanent expression of goodness, and Socrates, by contrast, is an immanent opening up to the transcendent
He's the symbol.
and symbol in the proper sense. So
Yeah.
so you have, in a way, the real symbol of the good, and the fake self-proclaimed image of the good, and
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Alcibiades is caught between them, and this is kind of the drama of his existence in a way.
Right. Right. And it takes you to that point where that yeah, so it's interesting because then, Socrates is so much the authority. I mean,
Hmm.
like, this is a real way in which like Socrates' authority is still very much the world we live in.
Yeah, yeah,
Like it has because he did mediate.
yeah,
Like that's
yeah.
what he did.
Oh, I mean, that's something I really want to think more about. I mean, first of all, it's kind of interesting when I worked on this book on authority. It was just a huge revelation for me, and I realized it's something that I'd been thinking about all along, but I never quite put it in words. I mean, it's what I was looking for in the Plato book, is this sense of authority. I mean, in a way, presenting Socrates. I don't know if the word comes up very often in there, but it's anyway. I've come to understand
I
that
don't
whole
remember
thing
it.
differently now. Yeah,
Yeah.
but you're exactly right. I mean, there's something. It's not an accident that this profound act of martyrdom, and there's some people that would object to the use of the word in that context, but he really does bear witness to the absoluteness of the good, and that bearing witness to the absoluteness of the good is what accounts for his dying,
Yeah.
and his dying then becomes this kind of privileged instantiation of the good, or
Yeah.
manifestation of the good. And
Yeah.
it's not an accident that that stands at the very beginning of the intellectual tradition of the West. I mean, that Socrates himself was this, not just because he had great ideas, but he embodied he bodied forth, in a way, this the authority of the true, the good, and the beautiful, in a way that has been the resource uh, for for the intellectual tradition of the West ever since, and not only the West, but
Yeah.
in a special way, the West. That's really an extraordinary fact, I think.
Yeah, understanding authority, like to the capacity for authority is very much the capacity to be transparent to the good.
Yeah, that's right. And this is why you see humility. This is why you see characters involved. I mean, it's a way of um, how you organize your own life, and um, how you live, and how you treat others, and so forth. I mean, how you live in the world
Yeah.
is part of the meaning of authority, because you're not just organizing things. You're actually in yourself, prior to any rules that you make or things that you say, but in your person, you are opening up a horizon of the meaning of human existence. And this happens if you have the office of authority. This happens whether you want it to or not. And this is why someone who does it poorly opens up the horizon of human existence, which turns out to be a very inadequate horizon.
Yeah.
But it affects the whole of the people that live in that community, whether
Yeah.
they want it to affect them or not. These things operate at an absolutely fundamental level.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then, and we're talking about political authority, but there's something similar and analogous in the home, you
Yeah.
know, in the workplace, in all of these various communities. There's always going to be some kind of an authority that sets the horizon for the unfolding of whatever form that community takes in the
Yeah.
particular instance. But it's inevitable.
Yeah. Yeah. Just to check in on time. I don't think we set for sure a boundary. Where are you at?
It's a few more minutes. I mean, we can start
Okay.
trying things. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Um, so I think there's one final piece that I'd like to bring in here, and get your thoughts on, which is the
Hmm.
the realm of AI. And then I had a question that I think might come in after this that somebody commented on our last video, and I think he had an interesting question about Bitcoin. I don't know. Um,
Oh,
so maybe we can bring that in a little bit. But first, like you brought in AI a couple times.
yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Right.
and there's this sense in which we're so many people are looking to AI as authority.
Right.
Like it's mediating personal relationships for people. It's mediating
Yeah.
connection to thinkers. It's mediating connection to information. And I mean the but yet the incapacity of AI to be embodied, the incapacity of AI
Yeah.
to have a real character of any genuine means, and to have risk, right?
Yeah.
The risk aspect, like all those are absent.
Right. Right. No, that's the thing. I think AI would be a really interesting example of a an especially powerful counterfeit kind of replacement
Mm,
because they're we look to it to make judgments for us, make decisions, and that's in a way one of the tasks of authority. But I mean, it is extraordinary precisely because it's not embodied, precisely because it's not. I mean, it's embodied in a certain way that you can't. There has to be some, But that in itself is fascinating. It tries to be as free from that as possible in a way. But there's no, you. It's hard to imagine what it could mean for something like that to love God, to love the transcendent. And then it's also hard to see what it could mean for that kind of machine to actually make a judgment
mm,
about what's true. I mean, it
mhm.
makes decisions, but they're all relative,
Yeah,
sifting of information. This idea of what is true is something that it doesn't really have the capacity and so that's interesting. Those are the If you think about it, we've got we don't have the prophet or the priest there, and so the kind of authority it's going to exercise is always going to be um inadequate in a radical way.
yeah,
And it's not a
yeah,
person, that's a I know John Vervaeke's got he's got one of the most substantial responses to that charge that I've encountered, but
yeah,
I'm still not entirely convinced it's hard. I just But who knows? We'll see how
yeah,
things unfold.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But like it certainly has the capacity to mediate patterns that people cannot see of
Right,
themselves.
right.
But it doesn't like its directionality and its purpose
Hmm.
is, at best just sort of idiosyncratically keyed in on what it can ascertain your goals are,
Yeah, yeah,
and at worst sort of nefariously manipulated.
yeah. I mean, it is curious to see how much discussion there is of about how these things are doing things that nobody really anticipates and can't explain. And I mean that's just fascinating. And then you've got the modal collapse problem about, the more it fills up the cybersphere or whatever with garbage, the more it's going to be recycling its own garbage in giving you judgments on things. And at a certain point, it's really going to be, because there's not the clarity of a kind of a real, yeah,
Yeah, it doesn't.
spirit.
I think it's that truth problem, right? It's like
Right.
if truth is the correspondence of propositions, then maybe you think it could have truth. But if truth is,
Hmm.
you know, I love that line. There's a line in Catherine Pickstock's
Hmm.
um oh,
Aspects of
aspects of truth. Yeah.
that.
Yeah, that, words always arrive too late. The truth has already moved beyond it.
Yeah,
And that
yeah,
in that sense, that the parsing of information, the capacity to actually, um like, information itself follows
yeah,
on from
yeah,
truth.
yeah. That's right.
Um,
That's right. Yeah, and truth requires something like a personal presence.
yeah,
Um, uh, and that's, the what is it about the truth that can't be fully captured by information?
yeah, yeah,
That's kind of the important question. Yeah.
yeah. Now, and so I am somewhat interested in this Bitcoin question, but it's all also like slightly orthogonal to what we're talking about.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know, like, do you is Bitcoin something you have any sort of interest in or much knowledge about,
I
or
haven't
would that
thought
not be
about it. I
interested
mean,
in you?
I think I've got kind of the layman's grasp of it, but I'd be interested to hear the question.
Okay, great. Well, we'll talk about it here. So I'll just read his. So he says, this is some context. There's this claim with Bitcoin that it is a return to sound money, akin to the gold standard, which presumably grounds Bitcoin in reality, i.e., the energy it takes to do it.
Mhm.
Bitcoiners imagine that Bitcoin is digital energy. However, my contention is that Bitcoin is actually a step further removed from reality, even further than our fiat system, because unlike with gold, with Bitcoin there is no encounter with beauty. In other
Mhm.
words, Bitcoin is not a thing in itself, though that is how Bitcoiners talk about it. It seems to me that Bitcoin is a purely human project, as opposed to being a participation in what God is doing that will inevitably result, as C.S. Lewis put it, in the abolition of man.
Yeah. I mean, I'm very sympathetic to that judgment. I wrote many, many, many years ago an essay on Plato and money,
Mm,
and uh, but the judgments about Bitcoin are very similar to the judgments that I sort of came to working through that on Plato. There is something about being able to have things rooted in what is real,
mm-hmm.
and what is real implying therefore truth, beauty, and goodness. If you think of those as, according to the tradition, convertible with being,
Yeah,
these things are essentially related to the res, to the reality, some actual real thing. Bitcoin doesn't do that at all. I mean, it's a purely abstract
yeah,
entity. Now, it might give the illusion of uh, returning to a kind of objective standard because it's outside of human will. It's not an
yeah,
arbitrary sort of
yeah,
fiat,
yeah,
and in a way, it seems to be have a kind of an objectivity that's protected against the arbitrariness of political decisions and so forth. But to my mind, that's as we've just been talking about, authority requires a will. It requires a
mm,
human being and a reality. And those, if we take for granted that a reality is somehow opposed to the will, we're going to leave in place a very arbitrary sense of will. We're going to kind of reinforce that arbitrary sense of will, and then juxtapose it to a purely abstract sense of what's objective and true. And that's a I think that's an illusion. That's something that will turn out in the long run to have problematic implications.
interesting.
So I don't know how this would be spelled out in terms of the actual economic implications of
Yeah,
Bitcoin.
yeah,
But these are at least a few principles to keep in mind, I think.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I don't know that I have enough to say that would be meaningful to add in there because I, yeah,
But
I'm
I
very
like
interested
that.
in Bitcoin in many ways,
Yeah,
but
I like the intuition that the person had about, I mean, it's amazing. You wouldn't think about um, uh, judging um, currency in relation to beauty, as that person did. So that there's a
yeah,
real
yeah,
insight there that I would agree with.
yeah, 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 yeah. Well, hey, Thank you so much.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Enjoyed it as ever. Uh, I look forward to the next one, Ken. I hope you have a good summer,
Yeah,
rest of the summer here.
thank you. Likewise, and we'll do it again soon, I hope.
Good, good.